There are 4 sections to this video. What it really says in the Quran, what Muslims tell you it says in the Quran, the good Muslim argument, mass deportation. Chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran. I'll restrict myself to only using Muslim sources here, no anti-Islamic websites. With each website I'll zoom into the URL address so you can check for yourself, and so you can see this is Muslims talking to other Muslims. This verse instructs Muslims to attack and murder Christians and Jews until they surrender and come under the control of Muslims and pay a form of tribute payment known as the jizya. People who don't think Islam is a problem tell us there are similar verses in the Christian and Jewish religious texts. There are 3 reasons why this is not a valid argument. Number 1. If it were true, and on close inspection it is not true, but if it were, that would not mitigate this. That would merely have made Christianity and Judaism worthy of criticism too. Number 2. The Quran is plastered with such verses, and it was the theme of Muhammad's later life to kill and enslave anyone who did not accept him as the messenger of God. Whereas the verses from the Bible people are picking on are from early on and are long since abrogated, no longer accepted parts of those religious traditions. Whereas what we are criticising in Islamic doctrine is totally contemporary and law in every Islamic state now. Right now, not 2,000 years ago. Number 3. There is no parallel in the Bible for verses such as 929, 923, 94 to 96, etc. The Quran preaches aggression and conquest of the entire world, whereas the Bible only comes close to that when referring to the conquest of Canaan 3,500 years ago. Where people do find genuine similarities between the Bible and the Quran, it is in some of the Sharia law punishments, which are sometimes the same in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. I don't want to conflate too many issues here and allow room for confusion, but I have to mention this to show the falsehood of the comparison. The material you're referring to in the Bible is irrelevant in terms of my first point. We would criticise the Christians if they still killed people for apostasy as required in Deuteronomy 13, for example. The material you're referring to in the Bible is irrelevant in terms of my second point, in that Christians no longer murder apostates. The material you're referring to in the Bible is also irrelevant in terms of my third point, in that on the one hand, none of your similar verses touch on the militant aspects of the Quran. They only show similarities in terms of Sharia. And on the other hand, almost all the similar sounding verses you can find don't actually say exactly the same thing when examined closely anyway. The Jews don't regard a woman being raped as consenting to illegitimate sexual conduct, for example. By convention, Muslims have always tended to mistranslate this verse, 929, so I will show you what it says in English, and also, after explaining its context, what it really says in Arabic. First, the context in chronological terms of chapter 9, verse 29. The Quran was most likely compiled in the 650s, more than 20 years after the death of Muhammad. At that time, the precise order of these verses were revealed in was not yet worked out, so the book is compiled in an almost random manner, with big chapters first and small chapters last. The order matters because according to Muhammad in chapter 2 verse 106, he said new verses abrogate older verses. This means if we see 2 verses which contradict each other, it is the latter verse which he wants his followers to obey. The first 29 verses of the 9th chapter were recited in the 10th month of the 9th year of Islamic history. This was some months after verses 30 to 129 were recited. What all this means is, there are only 3 tiny verses in the tiny 110th chapter in the entire Quran dated to after verse 29 of chapter 9, and they are merely speaking of how great it will be when Islam has conquered the whole earth. So there is no peaceful verse abrogating this verse which tells Muslims to attack unbelievers. Having dealt with that point, let's examine what it really says. We have to scroll past a lot of translations before we find an honest one. Why, on the odd rare occasion, do we find people who see the implication of killing in a word we are told merely means fight? Well, firstly, we know from Muhammad's own example of committing mass murders of prisoners on every occasion where he was able to do so, that boxing or wrestling was not what he wanted his followers to do with unbelievers. Also, the conventional word for fight is not what is seen here in the Quran. Here, a Muslim explains to other Muslims that the word qatalu, the word we just saw translated as fight, actually means kill. So why, in English versions of the Quran, is it almost always translated as fight? Even if that verse had merely been telling Muslims to fight unbelievers, it would still be an unhealthy theme for the doctrine of a religious cult which is growing in our country. Let's look at some supposedly tolerant verses often quoted at you by Muslims and Islamophiles. The most famous is chapter 2, verse 256, where it says, "There is no compulsion in religion." There are three possible interpretations for this, and I'll cover a couple of them fast. I'll first dispense with the one you are being asked to believe, that it means Muslims should not use compulsion to make people accept Islam. Well, firstly, that is not what it means, and secondly, just look at every Islamic nation where apostates are killed and unbelievers often killed on any old pretext too. Also, remember the rule of abrogation, which means that if that is what it had meant, it has been abrogated by later verses advising harshness for unbelievers. The second chapter of the Quran is actually the first to be recited after Muhammad's move to Yathrib, now known as Medina. He was having no luck convincing the other tribes to convert to his new religion. My own personal interpretation is that this, according to Muhammad, is simply Allah explaining his lack of luck by telling him that religion is one of those things where people are stubborn and can't be compelled. Later, of course, Muhammad discovers that he can compel people. Surah 109. You have your religion and I have mine. You are asked to believe this means Muslims should accept that other people have their own religions, despite the later chapters all repeatedly telling Muslims to accept no such thing. There are two other far more plausible interpretations. The one most commonly believed by Muslims themselves is that this was advice given by Muhammad to his followers on what to say when asked to convert back to the pagan religion. Although it is compiled as the 109th chapter, it was actually the 18th to be recited, and is from early on in his career as a prophet, when he lived in Mecca and was in quite a weak position. My own personal interpretation of the meaning of these verses is that this is the instruction of Allah to Muhammad himself in response to a question put to him, where he was asked to kiss two idols and worship the gods of his tribe for a year, in return for which they offered to worship his God alongside their own. I think this collection of verses is him saying that his God, Allah, has commanded him to respond in such a fashion, and to say to the pagans, "You have your religion, and I have mine." Let's test the logic of a popular argument put forward to justify our ignoring this problem. We are told most Muslims are nice. Okay, if I were to tell you that only a third of the sweets in this bag of sweets were poisoned, 2/3 of these sweets are totally harmless and taste really nice, can you give them to your children, or are you going to have to throw them away? This is still a poisonous bag of sweets. It doesn't make any difference if there are good ones in there too. Oh, and let's see how big the supposedly moderate majority is.
How many of you agree that the punishments described in the Quran and the Sunnah, whether it is death, whether it is stoning for adultery, whatever it is, if it is from Allah and His Messenger, that is the best punishment ever possible for humankind, and that is what we should apply in the world? Who agrees with that? Allahu Akbar. Are you all radical extremists? Subhanallah.
Another false argument often put forward is that there is nothing we can do about it. We get told people who have been born here cannot be deported. Historically, most people we exiled were born here. Mass deportation is in the manifesto of at least 4 of the smaller political parties, and is now supported by more than 50% of the UK population, according to one recent poll. People say you cannot ban a religion, but we can see plenty of examples in recent history. Take Gaza, for example. The last Jew had to leave in 2005, and so for the first time in 3,500 years, there are no Jews in Gaza. Also, the once thriving Christian population there has by now been almost totally eliminated. So it is possible to get rid of a religious group. The Palestinians in Gaza have experienced no international condemnation whatsoever. We need to merely think in terms of removing 300,000 Muslims from our country. 3 million is too big a target and perhaps unnecessary. 300,000 is 10% of their population, and if we select the correct people, it would be more like 20% of the problem gone. If you fear the backlash from a Muslim population in response to mass deportation, then you ought to fear even more the consequences of allowing the population to grow until they no longer need an excuse to go to war with us. If there is a big backlash, then that is best dealt with by rushing to remove the next 300,000 and so on and so forth, until we no longer have to live in fear of the displeasure of a Muslim minority. The harder they fight, the more speedily we need to deport. If only 10% exile is envisaged and further exiles are uncertain, then what will actually happen is many Muslims will not want to effectively volunteer for selection into that 10% by being seen to riot. Many Muslims will renounce Islam and thus avoid the need for exile. Entire families should be removed as a group. When we are merely taking 300,000 out of their population, we can be quite selective and prioritise those families where family members have been associated with problems in the past. We can target those families where they seem to be having the largest numbers of children. We can target the most radical sects. Wahhabi and Salafi would be the most radical. In the case of the Ahmadiyya Muslims, they are completely benign and ought to be exempt from this. There are many atheists who are nominally Muslims simply to avoid violence from other Muslims. Such people would obviously be exempt. We can avoid deportations where we can convert more Muslims to atheism. Offering counselling to families might persuade some that their religion is nonsense and that there is no Allah. The best way of doing this would be to play them a couple of videos rather than relying on the competence of staff.